What we do in life echoes in eternity.
Gladiator, directed by Ridley Scott, was the first monumental blast of the new century for cinema, and brought the epic genre into the 21st century with thunderous fury. It helped to reintroduce audiences to one of Hollywood's oldest mainstays in the Roman sword and sandals epic, a genre that had long since passed into obscurity from the general public's conscience. It's a genre that never truly goes away, and audiences will sooner rather than later be once again clamouring for the Roman epic, and Gladiator just happened to come along at the right time. It replicated many of the same elements that were used by the epics of old. It's a sweeping story about one man's quest that takes you all across the Roman Empire and right into Rome's beating heart. It has a grand cast that features rising stars and acting legends alike, to its variety of locations, huge sets, and countless number of extras. Scott, with the help of countless others, updated many of these key ingredients to make it more palatable for the modern audience, with all of the added benefits of using the most cutting-edge CGI and VFX technology at the time to help enhance his vision of Rome, giving the audience something they could only imagine in their wildest dreams. The huge gamble that DreamWorks and Scott took would turn out to be an unexpected smash hit, leaving an incredible lasting impact and legacy that Scott still uses to this day, having just recently finished making and releasing its sequel at the time of me making this video. But that legacy wouldn't exist without the enormous effort that went into making the original film, the modern classic that it is. So it shouldn't be surprising that just like any of those past epics, the production behind Gladiator is a mammoth story itself. In this video series, I'll be detailing the incredible journey that it took to make Gladiator. This first video will be detailing the origins of Gladiator, the pitch meeting, the writing of the first draft, how the director was chosen, and the writing of the script. How the idea of Gladiator came about might surprise you, as contrary to what you might think, it didn't start with Ridley Scott, Russell Crowe, or anyone at DreamWorks, but actually with a screenwriter called David Franzoni. Franzoni first got the idea for Gladiator way back in 1972, when he got sick of university and dropped out after only 1 year, deciding to take his motorcycle and go on a trip around Europe, seeing loads of ancient amphitheatres before eventually making his way to the Middle East, ending up in Baghdad, where he swapped a book on the Irish Revolution for a book called Those About to Die by Daniel P. Mannix. Franzoni described the book as a pulpy story about Roman gladiators and a very
tawdry sort of overview of the Colosseum and the games.
However, what hooked Franzoni was the fact that the book made the connection between the ancient games and modern sports. That connection left a lasting impression on Franzoni, to the point where he could not forget about it and thought,
Gee, make a great movie someday.
Franzoni would continue his travels around the world, finding himself in India, where he decided he wanted to become a screenwriter. He got his start co-writing the script for Jumping Jack Flash in 1986, and then for Citizen Cone in 1992, a movie that would win him 3 awards. Just 5 years after that, Franzoni managed to get himself a free picture deal with, at the time, a relatively new company called DreamWorks Pictures. At DreamWorks, Franzoni would first write the script for Amistad, which was to be directed by Steven Spielberg. While Franzoni was working on Amistad, the film was shooting in Rome, and while there, he would take trips to the local library, reading up and researching the history of the city. In doing so, he unlocked a memory about the Colosseum and the gladiators that had long been forgotten. Franzoni remembered this idea of doing a film about gladiators and the Colosseum, showing someone at the top of Roman society suddenly becoming a slave and being trained to become a gladiator, having to fight for his life in the Colosseum, all for an emperor's entertainment. This idea was further stoked by Franzoni writing Amistad, which also deals with slaves and slavery. With this idea fresh in his head, Franzoni worked on a pitch for the potential Gladiator movie while finishing up Amistad. Once Amistad was finished and released, it would turn out to be a moderate success, but for Franzoni, the main takeaway was the establishment of a good relationship with not only Spielberg, but DreamWorks and its other main producers as well. With a good relationship established from Amistad and the picture deal securely in place, Franzoni took it as the perfect opportunity to pitch his idea to the producers at DreamWorks. Having a firm idea of what he wanted, and having worked out the majority of his idea about Gladiators and the Colosseum, Franzoni went in to see Spielberg, and Spielberg had already heard ahead of time that Franzoni was going to come in and pitch a film about gladiators, the Colosseum, and the Roman Empire. The meeting was small, with it just being Franzoni, Spielberg, and another producer called Walter Parkes. During the pitch, Spielberg asked Franzoni 3 questions.
So, David, I understand you want to do a movie about a gladiator. And I go, yeah. In ancient Rome, yeah. In the Colosseum in ancient Rome, yes. Okay. And that was it.
Walter Parkes would later call Franzoni that day just to make sure that Franzoni actually had a story worked out, to which Franzoni replied,
David, do you have a story worked out? And I said, I've got it all worked out, Walter, so don't fear.
Walter Parkes would later describe the pitch as,
it was just one of those pitches that, on a conceptual level, made sense immediately.
Along with finding
the emotional contour, again, in the very most rudimentary form, the emotional contours were there of this basic hero's journey.
Despite what Parkes thought, many around him questioned his and Spielberg's decision to take on such a risky project like a sword and sandals epic with so little to go off. I mean, at this point, Franzoni didn't even have a script draft. It was just some ideas of his, but his passion for his ideas is what really helped him. The skepticism from people around Parkes was for good reason. Such large films of this genre were expensive to make, and because of that, they had a much higher chance of failing to recoup the money invested into them. A couple of notable box office failures in the past, such as Barabbas and The Fall of the Roman Empire, showed the lack of audience interest in the genre and how outdated they had become. The genre wasn't helped by films like A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum and History of the World Part 1, and later Life of Brian, which heavily parodied and lampooned many of the tropes and genre characteristics. By the 70s, they had largely died off in Hollywood, with most of the big studios deciding it was best to stay away from making any more for the longest time. The genre did continue for a while longer in Italy, but many of these were poorly made and laughable in quality. Eventually, they declined in Italy along with the Italian film industry in the 80s. The late 90s were different, however, with enough time having passed in Hollywood at least that Spielberg, Parkes, and another producer who was brought on called Douglas Wick from Red Wagon Entertainment, they all thought the timing was now just right that they could give a fresh take on the genre, with it being the perfect opportunity to reintroduce the cinema-going audience to the world of Rome and sword and sandal epics. Wick later gave his reasoning as to why he chose to support the idea. No one had done this kind of spectacle in 30 years, and it was an opportunity that hadn't been visited in a long time. We felt that audiences were getting tired of space movies, and that to revisit Rome was to take them to an extraordinary spectacle. Now that Franzoni had his pitch accepted, he got right to researching the time period for his script. Franzoni was helped in researching by Suzanne Druva, who was the then head of the research department at DreamWorks. Franzoni read the Augusta Histories, also known as Historia Augusta, which is a collection of biographies about Roman emperors. Upon reading it, Franzoni picked out the reigns of Emperor Marcus Aurelius and Emperor Commodus as a focal point for his script. The reason he picked out this time period is because during this time, the gladiatorial games were extremely popular, especially under the reign of Commodus. It was also a period of a lot of change and drama, with the deaths of Marcus Aurelius and the ascension of his son Commodus. This exact period had already been picked for another film for similar reasons, with the already mentioned The Fall of the Roman Empire, directed by Anthony Mann. The Fall of the Roman Empire, while different from Gladiator, would share a surprising amount in common with Gladiator, especially in the first act. Franzoni did a basic amount of research into the time period and spent the rest of his research time in the Colosseum before getting to a point where he absorbed all of the information he could. At that point, he brought his research to Wick, who went through it and became more and more fascinated with the period. The more research Wick looked at, the more he got on board with the whole project, seeing the Colosseum as the epicenter of Rome and the gladiatorial games as a peephole into the Roman world and society. He also saw the potential in the subject of Rome and gladiators in terms of how it could relate to modern-day audiences. The other producers saw the same comparison as well, with Franzoni telling Spielberg specifically,
in a way, this really isn't about ancient Rome at all. This is about Los Angeles 1,000 years from now. Colosseum is Dodger Stadium.
In early April 1998, with the basic research finished and the producers more on board with the project, Franzoni felt comfortable to get started on writing the first draft of the script. Franzoni wrote his first draft to be more based on history than fiction, and to help him with this, DreamWorks brought in Kathleen Coleman, who had a deep knowledge of the gladiatorial games and at the time taught a class on Roman games at Harvard, which Franzoni seemed surprised about.
Now teaches at Harvard, teaches a class in the Roman games, if you can believe that.
Coleman consulted Franzoni on the script and told him what was historically right and tried to correct him on things that were historically wrong. She also told him about things that could have been potentially historically accurate, and if Coleman herself wasn't sure on a specific topic, she would let Franzoni know. Franzoni took whatever she wasn't 100% on and used it in the script. From Franzoni speaking about his experience and an interview with Coleman by the Harvard magazine, it seemed to have been a very contentious relationship, with Coleman describing the experience as, "It was interesting, but ultimately a disillusioning experience, because some of my comments on the script were incorporated, but the script kept changing." Ultimately, Coleman's involvement made the original draft much closer to the real history, but because of the changes to the script, over the course of the production, much of her involvement got wiped away in the end. Despite that, she was glad that the film had reawakened interest in Roman history. To show how different Franzoni's original draft was to the final script, we can first look at who Franzoni chose to be his main protagonist. He chose Narcissus as the main character. Narcissus in real life was a wrestler who strangled Commodus to death in his bath. Franzoni would use Narcissus as a base and slightly change him for his first draft, keeping him mostly the same, but making him a general who won the war in Germania for Marcus Aurelius. After Marcus's death, Narcissus is condemned and becomes a slave, fighting in the Colosseum before eventually strangling Commodus in the Colosseum sand and sailing off into the sunset with his family. While it took some liberties with the history, it was a lot more accurate than what we got in the final version. From this, however, you can also see the groundwork that was laid by Franzoni for the final version of Maximus that we ended up getting. Franzoni would work on the script for nearly a year before presenting his draft to Wick and Parks. The pair read through it, and after finishing it, they got very excited because they saw the immense potential the film had. What made Wick excited was seeing the raw character journey that went through the Roman world and the Colosseum. He knew that in the hands of the right director, especially one that was a true visualist and had the right vision for the project, its potential was limitless. Wick and Parks knew that the task to find said director wouldn't be easy, but the pair actually found it quite daunting. They both knew that their perfect director would have to be able to match their enthusiasm and vision, since anyone subpar wouldn't work in the long run. Wick feared that a mediocre director could ruin the film and turn it into a little bit of a toga fear. Their faith in the project, however, would give them the motivation they needed to find the right director. The pair kept two things in mind when picking a potential director. The first one was their ability to do a serious dramatic piece, and the second one was their ability to make a spectacle. From this thought process, Wick and Parks made up a shortlist of people they thought could work as the director. Parks notes,
"There's a tiny, tiny handful of directors who can create worlds, who can deal with enormous technical problems, and here's the important point, but not be overwhelmed by them, not literally forsake the really important issues of narrative and story and theme because the pursuit of the size is crushing."
When the pair looked at their small list, their eyes were drawn to one name, and one name only: That name was Ridley Scott. They both saw Scott as having the ability to create coherent other worlds, already seeing his work on films like Blade Runner, Alien, and 1492, Conquest of Paradise. With these past experiences, they knew that Scott would be the perfect choice for director, and so Parks contacted Scott to arrange a meeting between them. Parks phoned Scott and asked him if he had a free 20 minutes in order for Parks to pitch the film to him, and Scott agreed. Wick and Parks then visited Scott in his office, bringing him the script and a reproduction of an old 19th century painting called Palais Verseau, which translates into English as "with turned thumbs." The painting depicts a gladiator in the Colosseum standing over his defeated foe, looking up at the spectating Vestal virgins with their thumbs pointed down. The painting, which was finished in 1872, was done by Jean-Léon Gérôme and is about power and high drama, the perfect analogy for what Gladiator was all about. Parks showed the painting to Scott first, before even showing him the script, and when Scott saw the painting, he went,
"Oh God," because I knew I was essentially, you want to bleep this? I was fucked.
Even though Scott had this reaction, he was more than intrigued and loved the painting, with it slowly convincing him to do the project the more he looked at it. Every so often, Scott would glance down at it while Parks was pitching the movie to him, and before Parks had even finished or shown him the script, Scott said, "I'm in, and I hope the script is okay." This is when Wick and Parks told him about how they planned to change the script and what their grand ideas were for the movie. Now with Scott on board, he immediately read through the script and knew it would need some work, seeing the overall story as the main issue. Scott also wanted to change many other smaller aspects about Franzoni's original script, and this is where the problems would start for the project. The problems with the script would proceed throughout the production, right up until the very end, and this made it a nightmare for just about everyone involved. To say the writing of the script for Gladiator was an absolute mess is quite an understatement. Many factors with the film's production caused major issues with the script, and in order to make sense of the convoluted story that is the writing of Gladiator's script, I am going to try and present the information in as concise and chronological manner as possible. Starting with Scott's desire to change Franzoni's original script. Scott felt that Franzoni had the right foundation and the overall plan laid down, but was missing a central act that would connect the protagonists' journey together. Scott held this opinion because originally in Franzoni's script, the protagonists went right from Germania to Rome, and Scott felt that they were in Rome for far too long, which used up the location's potential and the ability to show the power of the Colosseum. To fix this, Scott cut down the time spent in Rome and then used the spare time to add in another location, making a connection to the journey between Germania and Rome. This eventually morphed into going through the North African desert and provinces, where the viewer would be able to see how the protagonist went from a general to a slave. Scott reasoned,
which could be through the North African provinces, where one could assume you'd have a lot of these slave camps and developments of where, from slaves to gladiators, etc., etc.
It was also to show how the protagonist went from the smaller arenas in the provincial provinces to the enormous Colosseum in Rome, creating that key connection point between the two locations and making the goal for the protagonist to become the hero of the story. Scott thought this would make the film more dramatic and powerful. Right around this time, Franzoni had finished his last draft and gave it to Scott. Once Scott had gotten Franzoni's last draft and read through it, he thought the script was getting to where he wanted it, but still felt it needed some work, especially in the dialogue. Scott noticed that some of Franzoni's dialogue just didn't come off right when he read it, and his characterizations were too on the nose. To try and fix the dialogue, Scott brought on playwright John Logan. Scott had met Logan when he needed someone to come in and write a script for a film Scott was an executive producer on, called RKO 281. Scott knew of John's talent and spoke with Parks about getting him in to help with the script. Parks agreed with Scott that Logan would be a good choice and brought him on. Logan and Scott would work together on the script, and Logan started helping Scott on some of the more unpolished areas of his new centre act. Logan mostly directed his attention towards Scott's new center act before moving on to cleaning up some of Franzoni's dialogue in the first act. On top of that, Logan also added many new scenes into the first act which weren't originally there in Franzoni's script. Logan's real interest when it came to writing was human relationships, and enjoyed exploring them in order to flesh out characters. With these added scenes, he allowed for the build-up of the characters in the first act. A couple of key examples that made it into the film is the scene where Marcus Aurelius talks to his daughter, Lucilla, about not wanting to talk about politics.
Enough of politics.
And another one is a scene where Maximus and Lucilla reunite after the battle on the Germanian front.
Is it really so terrible seeing me again?
Both of these scenes are early on in the film and help to establish these characters and give us a better understanding of the character dynamics between Lucilla and Marcus, and Lucilla and Maximus, respectively. Logan also helped to restructure the whole of the last act, but kept many of the references to the life and times of the characters from Franzoni, which was fairly well researched according to Scott.
Which he was fairly well researched.
Logan spent a lot of time reworking Franzoni's dialogue and creating new scenes. When he had finished his draft, he showed it to Scott and the other producers, which was received quite well by them. It fixed many of the issues with Franzoni's script and also gave a more fleshed out journey. Franzoni was even sure that most of the best dialogue that survived was John Logan's.
I'm pretty sure most of the dialogue that survives, most of the best dialogue that survives is John's.
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true emperor Marcus Aurelius.
Parks, upon reading Logan's rewrites, realised that the film, with this script, could be so much more than just a great action movie. Seeing it as a film that could delve into more complex topics, which is something Franzoni was originally aiming for. The script was shaping up to be something really special with the work Franzoni, John, and a little bit of Scott had put in, but there was still an issue with the script that hadn't been fully resolved, and they soon hit a narrative wall that almost derailed the entire project before they had even gotten past finishing the script. That finishes episode 1 of the insane production behind Gladiator. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. While researching the production of this film, I was truly astonished at the level of work that went into making this modern day epic. Because of that, I have decided for the first time to make this into a series, as covering it in just 1 or 2 videos wouldn't do justice to the film or the people who made it. In the next video, I will be covering the issues with the narrative in the script, the fact that they had to bring on another writer, and the constant delays and rewrites that plagued the production. Beyond that, other episodes will follow, covering the rest of the production right up until the end, and its eventual sequel 20 years on from the original.